Imagine a man who was born in a one-room log cabin in the middle of the Kentucky wilderness. A man who had less than 1 year of formal education. A man who lost his mother when he was just 9 years old. A man who watched his beloved sister die in childbirth. A man who lost 2 of his sons to disease. And a man who was so consumed by depression that his friends feared he would take his own life. Now imagine that this same man would become the greatest president in American history, a man who would preserve the Union, end the institution of slavery, and deliver the most eloquent speeches ever uttered by an American leader. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, a man who rose from the deepest poverty to the highest office in the land. A man who was tested by the greatest crisis in American history, and a man who paid the ultimate price for his convictions. But here is what most people do not realize about Abraham Lincoln. The man who is remembered as the great emancipator, the man who freed the slaves, was not always an abolitionist. He was a man who evolved, a man who grew, a man who changed his mind about the most important issues of his time. He was a man who was deeply conflicted about race, a man who initially believed that the races should be separated, a man who struggled with the moral implications of slavery, and a man who ultimately came to believe that the institution of slavery was an abomination that had to be destroyed. He was a man of profound contradictions, a man who was both a product of his time and a visionary who saw beyond it. He was a man who was not just a politician. He was a man who was a poet, a storyteller, a wit, and a man whose soul was filled with a deep and abiding sense of melancholy. To understand Abraham Lincoln, you have to go back to the beginning, to the dense forests of Hardin County, Kentucky, where he was born on February 12, 1809, into a world of poverty and hardship. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and a carpenter, a man who was constantly on the move, searching for better land and better opportunities. His mother, Nancy Hankins Lincoln, was a woman of deep intelligence and spiritual conviction, a woman who taught her son to read and to think for himself. The family lived in a one-room log cabin, a crude structure with a dirt floor and a single window. They were poor, but they were proud. They were a family that believed in the value of hard work, the importance of faith, and the power of education. Abe was a bright and curious boy, a boy who was fascinated by words, by stories, and by the mysteries of the world. He would walk for miles to borrow a book, and he would read by the light of the fire long after his family had gone to sleep. He was a boy who was determined to rise above his circumstances, a boy who was determined to make something of himself. The family moved to Indiana in 1816 in search of better land. It was a brutal journey, a trek through the wilderness that tested the limits of their endurance. They settled in a remote area known as the Little Pigeon Creek community, where they built a new cabin and began to clear the land. It was a life of unimaginable hardship. They were surrounded by wolves, bears, and snakes, and they faced constant threats from the weather and the wilderness. It was here that tragedy struck. In 1818, Nancy Hankins Lincoln died of milk sickness, a disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. Abe was just 9 years old. He was devastated. His mother had been his anchor, his source of love and stability. Her death left a void that would never be filled. He became a withdrawn and melancholy boy, a boy who was often lost in his own thoughts. He was a boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, a boy who had learned the harsh lessons of life at an early age. His father remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, a woman who brought with her 3 children and a sense of order and stability to the household. She was a kind and loving stepmother, a woman who encouraged Abe's love of reading and learning. She recognized his intelligence and his potential, and she did everything she could to support him. He was a boy who was deeply grateful for her kindness, a boy who was determined to live up to her expectations. He continued to educate himself, reading every book he could get his hands on. He was a voracious reader, a man who was constantly searching for new ideas, new perspectives, and new ways of understanding the world. He was a man who was building the foundation for his future. In 1830, the family moved again, this time to Illinois. Abe was now a young man, a man who was ready to make his own way in the world. He worked as a rail splitter, a store clerk, and a surveyor. He was a man who was willing to do whatever it took to survive. He was also a man who was deeply ambitious, a man who was determined to achieve greatness. He began to involve himself in local politics, and he was elected to the Illinois General Assembly in 1834. It was the beginning of his political career, a career that would eventually lead him to the White House. He was a man who was learning the art of politics, a man who was developing the skills that would make him one of the greatest leaders in American history. The next decade was a period of growth and transformation. Lincoln studied law, and he became a successful attorney, a man who was known for his honesty, his integrity, and his ability to persuade juries. He was a man who was deeply committed to justice, a man who believed that the law should be used to protect the rights of the weak and the vulnerable. He married Mary Todd in 1842, a woman of intelligence and ambition, a woman who shared his political aspirations. They had 4 children, but tragedy would stalk them. Their son, Eddie, died of tuberculosis at the age of 3, a loss that devastated both parents. He was a man who was deeply affected by the death of his son, a man who was forced to confront the fragility of life. He was a man who was carrying a heavy burden, a man who was often consumed by a deep and abiding melancholy. Lincoln served a single term in the United States House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849. It was an undistinguished term, a period of frustration and disappointment. He was a man who was out of step with the political currents of his time. He was a man who was deeply conflicted about the issue of slavery, a man who was searching for a way to reconcile his personal beliefs with the political realities of his time. He returned to Illinois, and he focused on his law practice. He was a man who was rebuilding his life, a man who was waiting for his moment. He was a man who believed he was destined for something greater. The turning point in his life came in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that allowed the residents of those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It was a law that effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, a law that had prohibited slavery north of a certain line. Lincoln was horrified. He saw the law as a betrayal of the principles of the Founding Fathers, a betrayal of the idea that slavery was a moral wrong that should not be allowed to spread. He threw himself back into politics, and he gave a series of powerful speeches that would make him a national figure. He was a man who was finding his voice, a man who was becoming a leader. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 were a turning point in American history. Lincoln challenged Senator Stephen A. Douglas, the most powerful Democrat in the country, for his seat in the Senate. The debates were a remarkable display of intellectual and political skill. Lincoln was a master of logic and rhetoric, a man who could dismantle his opponent's arguments with a devastating wit and a powerful moral clarity. He argued that slavery was a moral wrong, a cancer that had to be contained. He argued that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. He lost the election, but he had won the intellectual battle. He had established himself as the leading voice of the Republican Party, the party of freedom. In 1860, Lincoln was elected President of the United States. He was a man who was facing the greatest crisis in American history. The Southern states, angered by his election, began to secede from the Union. He was a man who was determined to preserve the Union, a man who believed that the nation was indivisible. He was a man who was willing to fight a war to save the country he loved. He was a man who was carrying the weight of the nation on his shoulders. He was a man who was often overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task before him. The Civil War was a brutal and bloody conflict, a war that would claim the lives of more than 600,000 Americans. Lincoln was a man who was constantly under pressure, a man who was dealing with the loss of his soldiers, the criticism of his generals, and the political opposition of his rivals. He was a man who was often consumed by his duties, a man who was working all the clock. He was a man who was bearing the burden of the nation. He was a man who was also dealing with personal tragedy. His son, Willie, died of typhoid fever in 1862, a loss that was devastating. He was a man who was losing his children, a man who was being tested by the most terrible forces of nature. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were free. It was a moment of profound moral clarity, a document that would change the course of history. He was a man who was moving towards a new understanding of the war, a man who was realizing that the war was not just about preserving the Union, it was about ending slavery. He was a man who was becoming the great emancipator. He was a man who was leading the nation towards a new birth of freedom. In November 1863, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, a speech that would become one of the most famous in American history. It was a short speech, a speech that was just 2 minutes long, but it was a speech that captured the essence of the American experiment. He spoke of a nation that was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He spoke of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It was a speech that was both a tribute to the fallen soldiers and a call to action for the living. It was a speech that would define his presidency and his legacy. The legacy of Abraham Lincoln is one of the most profound in human history. He is remembered as the man who preserved the Union, the man who ended slavery, and the man who delivered some of the most eloquent speeches ever uttered by an American leader. He is a symbol of the power of the human spirit, a man who rose from the most humble beginnings to achieve the greatest of heights. He is a man who is celebrated as a hero, a man whose story continues to inspire people around the world. He is a man who has been honored with statues, memorials, and monuments. He is a man who is remembered as the greatest president in American history. Why should someone born today still care about Abraham Lincoln? Because his life is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the importance of perseverance. He was a man who overcame the most difficult circumstances, a man who was not content to be average, a man who was determined to change the world. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of justice is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human imagination, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a politician, he was a man who was a poet, a storyteller, a wit, and a man whose soul was filled with a deep and abiding sense of melancholy. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.